Hello, and welcome to Lab 1. If you have your lab activity sheet and PowerPoint open or with you, I will be going through this lab sheet that has all the required terms listed on it. It also has all the different exercises that match up with the lab manual. These exercises will help kind of reinforce and work through and learn a lot of the different information that we will be covering throughout the entire semester here. So during lab 1, we're going to get an introduction to different types of tissues because this is what's going to show up on our first lab practical is these different tissues. So we've got our different epithelial tissues. Epithelial tissues are tissues they usually line some sort of surface. Like your skin, the top layers of your skin are epithelial tissues. They're going to line like your mouth, your stomach, your throat, down, your whole digestive tract, a lot of your urinary tract, reproductive tract. These are tissues that line specific surfaces. But we also have glandular. So glandular means these are glands, like sweat glands. You may have heard of endocrine glands, glands that make your hormones. So these are all things that we're going to be covering in the first few labs, first few chapters within your textbook as well. We'll go into more detail on these when we go through more specific tissues. We also have connective tissues. Connective tissues are tissues that usually lie underneath these epithelial tissues. There's a lot of different types of connective tissue. They can be split off into different groups, which is why we have this nice little diagram that shows how they connect or dive off into different directions. Your bones is a connective tissue, so is blood. These are all specific connective tissues. Cartilage, these line most of your bones. We'll go through that when we get to the chapter on the skeletal system later on. Muscle. We all know about skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle is the muscle that helps you move your body. We have smooth muscle. Smooth muscle lines, say, your blood vessels, a lot of your digestive tract. Cardiac muscle is your heart. So it's going to help your heart beat. And then we have nervous tissue. Here now, you just need to introducing this to you as nervous tissue. We'll go into more detail about it when we, again, get to this specific type of tissue. I just want to kind of introduce you. This is our spine. A lot of this is repeat here from the lecture on chapter 1. We go through a lot of the stuff here in lab. Our spine is split up into different sections. Our cervical spine is your neck. That thoracic spine is going to be your upper part of your back where your rib cage is attached. And then we have our lumbar spine. Lumbar is that low back. And then we have our sacral and then our coccyx. These are different regions within our spine that get broken up into different segments to make it kind of easier to determine where something might be happening. Let's go through some of these directional terms. They are found on the lab sheet. They're found within anatomical terms section. These are listed in alphabetical order to kind of help you figure out where we're going. As I go down this chart, they're going to be found in different areas if you wanted to take notes somewhere. Superior. When we're talking about something that is superior, we're talking about something that is above something else. Like your head is superior to your chest. Your hips or your abdomen is superior to your hips. You can use it to talk to about a lot of different areas, a lot of different parts of the spine and the body. Inferior is just the opposite. Inferior means that it's below something else. So if you're comparing two body parts, when something is inferior, like your hips are inferior to your belly button. Your shoulders are inferior to your head. Or here, the navel is inferior to the chin. Anterior. Ventral is the other term that you will hear for anterior. Ventral means anterior. It's just the anatomical term for anterior. And it just means something that's towards the front of the body. The example from this book here is your breastbone is anterior to your spine. There's a lot of things that heart is anterior to your spine, your abdomen, your stomach. I should say your actual stomach is anterior to your kidneys, to your pancreas. So anterior can be used for a lot of things. Posterior or dorsal. You will hear dorsal in other places throughout the semester as well. Dorsal just means that it's towards the back of the body, as this states right here, or it's behind something else. So your small intestine is posterior to your navel, that belly button. Your heart is posterior to that breastbone. So there's a lot of different ways we can go through this. Medial. Medial, middle. You think of it that way. So it's towards the middle of the body. So this example from your textbook, the heart is medial to the arm. Your heart is also medial to your lungs. Your stomach is medial to your kidneys. Your bladder is medial to your hip bones. Lateral is opposite. Lateral is towards that outside, away from the body. So if we're talking about lateral being further away from that middle, your hip bones are lateral to your bladder. You can go with the same thing. Your kidneys are lateral to your stomach. Your arms or shoulders are lateral to that breastbone. Intermediate is when we're talking about something that is between two structures. So your book says the collarbone that is intermediate to the breastbone and the shoulder. I don't know why they wrote intermediate between. It's just intermediate to the breastbone and the shoulder. The heart is intermediate to both of your lungs. It is between both lungs. Proximal. Proximal, thank you, pen. And distal. This is for arms and legs only. A lot of students mix these up for this purpose because it is for your arms and your legs only. So proximal means that it's closer to your trunk, your body. So your elbow is proximal to your wrist. So we're saying your elbow is closer to your body than your wrist is. You could also say your wrist is proximal to your fingers. So we're saying your wrist is closer to that trunk than your fingers are. Distal. Distal is the exact opposite. So it means it's further away from your trunk. The knee is distal to the thigh. So we're saying the knee is further away from your trunk than your thigh is. Your ankle is distal to your knee. Your wrist is distal to your elbow. And then we have superficial or external. We may hear external different places throughout this semester. Superficial just means it's closer to that body surface. So the skin is superficial to the skeletal muscles. The skeletal muscles are superficial to the bones. Your rib cage is superficial to your heart and lungs because those lie underneath your ribs. Then we go deep. This means it's further away from that body surface or it's more internal. So the lungs are deep to the skin. The muscles are deep to the skin. The bones are deep to your muscles. Let's see here, your intestines are deep to your umbilicus or your belly button or navel. Those three things are the exact same. Let's look at the different planes. These planes are going to come in handy for a lot of different things. Like these images even show how these planes are used. A median or mid-sagittal. Mid-sagittal, that is a term that you'll see on like the lecture exam. Hint. But median means we're cutting it down the middle. Mid-sagittal is a direct middle cut, so you have the exact same amount of body on right as you do left. So it's exactly down the middle, so you get a right and a left side. So this one you have a right and left side. Frontal or coronal plane. Frontal kind of gives you a hint that you're going to have a front and a back. So we're cutting you in the middle to give you that front and that back side. And then transverse. Transverse gives you slices up the body. This is how an MRI is run. Same with the CT. They're slices. They take tons of little tiny slices traveling up the body or down, or depending on what they're looking for. So with this one, you're going to get a top and a bottom. The different cavities. The body can be split into different cavities. These cavities usually have some sort of tissue that's wrapping around these specific cavities that usually contain organs within them, like cranial. Your skull is also known as your cranium. So if we are taking this cranium, it's that cranial cavity. We also have that vertebral cavity. The vertebral cavity that travels down your spine. Your spine is made up of a bunch of bones that are called vertebrae. Since they're made up of all these different vertebrae, this vertebrae is what makes up this spine or this vertebral column, known as that vertebral cavity. The cranial cavity and the vertebral cavity give us the dorsal body cavity. Again, dorsal means posterior. Now let's look at the front. New color. We have our thoracic cavity. Our thoracic cavity is those thoracic vertebrae that have the ribs. So this is what is found inside of your rib cage. We have a superior mediastinum. We have our pleural cavity. And then we have the pericardial. Cardial means heart. Peri, we're wrapping around, so it's around the heart. Pleural, back up here. Pleural means lungs. Pericardial means heart. Helping to kind of break down what these different words mean. What separates the thoracic cavity from this abdominal cavity is our diaphragm. Our diaphragm is a muscle that sits in here. This is the muscle that lets us breathe. So when we breathe, our diaphragm contracts. When it contracts, it travels down. These cavities here work together to do a lot of different things. You'll learn between this class and Anatomy 2 what all these different cavities do. We also, within the abdominal cavity, I should say, contains most of your digestive organs. So your stomach, your small intestine, your large intestine, these all sit in this abdominal cavity. Then we have the pelvic cavity. It might help if I had the right writing utensil. The pelvic cavity. This is your bladder, any reproductive organs, and then that rectum. This is all contained within this pelvic cavity. Your pelvic cavity can be combined with the abdominal cavity to make that abdominal pelvic cavity. They kind of come all together. The thoracic, abdominal, and pelvic cavities are going to make up the ventral body cavity. Ventral means, whoops, anterior. My bad handwriting there, sorry. Anterior, so these are towards the front of the body. So these different cavities are made of, they are membranes. These membranes are known as a serosa. That's just another name for these membranes. You'll probably hear more cavities throughout this classes, but just kind of as an FYI, if you hear serosa, it's a membrane. It's these membranes up here. It's the tissues that make this up. So these membranes are made up of two layers of tissues. So it's that double layered membrane. It's going to cover all of the surfaces in that ventral body cavity. These two layers each has their own name. We have the parietal serosa. So this faces away from that organ, whatever cavity or body area that is this membrane is around, sorry, it's faces away from it. The visceral means that it's on top of. So this is the layer that lays right on top of the heart, right on top of the lungs, on top of that abdominal cavity. That's that visceral serosa. There's a small thin layer. So if we have a sac per se that has an organ in it, there's two layers. That parietal is going to be the outside layer. That visceral is that inside layer that sits directly on top of the heart. There is some fluid found inside of this space between these two tissues, these two layers of this membrane. This is a serous type of fluid that is found in this space between these two types of tissues. This fluid is actually secreted by both of these layers. It is made from that visceral, that layer right on top of that organ, and that parietal layer that's right directly on top or facing away from that organ. Both those layers are making this fluid found in between these two layers. Some specific names. I mentioned the pericardium. New color. Cardium or cardiac means heart. So this is the layer that is around the heart. Pleura means lung. So this is the layer that sits directly on top of the lungs. And then the last one, the peritoneum. This is the layer that wraps specifically around this abdominal pelvic cavity, is known as that peritoneum. So these are different membranes that we'll be working with throughout the first part of Anatomy 1, and then you'll hear about them and work with them more in Anatomy 2. So how these membranes work, I kind of drew a picture above, but this is a really good example. This was actually the picture I was looking for earlier, was this. Think of like a balloon. It's not blown up completely because then you can't kind of stick your fist down inside of it. That creates those two different layers, that outer layer, that parietal, the one that is directly around this fist is that visceral layer. These are the two layers that make up this membrane. Here's that pericardial membrane. So you see that parietal layer that's facing away from the heart. You have that visceral pericardium. This is the one that lays directly on top of the heart. And then we have this pericardial space with this serous fluid that is found between these two layers here. Our quadrants. This was going to come back to you a lot. We'll learn it here in this section. Those of you who are going into nursing, maybe physician's assistant, medical programs, this will come back to you a lot, these different quadrants. So how these quadrants work is you take the belly button, or the umbilicus, as it's also known as, or the navel, and then from there, you draw a horizontal and a vertical line. This is going to separate the abdominal pelvic area off into 4 different quadrants. Now, the nice thing is, these quadrants are all named for where they're located. So that upper right quadrant, or right upper quadrant, left upper quadrant, right lower quadrant, and left lower quadrant. While you're going through most of your classes, they don't really let you label these as RUQ, LUQ, RLQ, LLQ, like right upper quadrant, left upper quadrant. They don't let you abbreviate them per se, but once you get out into practice, most people abbreviate everything, so, or most things, so that's when those will come back into play. They also can split things off into a 9-quadrant system. This is what I learned as a chiropractor. Everything was thrown into this 9-quadrant system for some reason. But now most people learn, most anatomists, people who study anatomy, use this 9-quadrant system more than anything else. Some of these terms you'll hear, like me in my nursing classes, knowing what hypochondriac means. Hypo means below, chondriac means ribs. So that right hypochondriac area is right around those ribs, at the baseline of those ribs. Epi means above, gastric means stomach. So this is the area above the stomach. Right lateral, left lateral, umbilical, because it contains that umbilicus or that belly button. And then right inguinal, left inguinal. Inguinal, there is a ligament that travels. They don't teach this in these classes, which surprises me. But anyways, the reason why it's called inguinal is at the crease of your hip. There is a ligament that travels along that crease that is known as the inguinal ligament. Part of your abdominal muscles actually make up that ligament, but that's where that inguinal comes from. And hypogastric is used more than that pubic region. Hypo again means below, gastric means stomach. So we have epigastric above the stomach, hypogastric below the stomach. I wanted to go through those terms and what they meant because some of these terms will come back. Epigastric, hypochondriac, hypogastric, and inguinal, those tend to come back to you. So let's start going through anatomical terms. Again, these are terms that you're going to use. Here, you will use them in your career. So I'm going to go down the list. We've been through abdominal, anterior, axillary. Axillary is your armpit. Axillary is a much nicer term than armpit when you're writing notes, taking notes on something. So that's where axillary. Brachial is your upper arm. So from your shoulder to your elbow, just about, is that brachial region. Carpal. Carpal is your wrist. There are 8 little bones that make up your wrist. They are known as the carpal bones. They also have their own individual names that you will learn when we get to the skeletal system. But those carpal bones, keep that name, carpal. Cephalic means head. So that's at the top, that head at the top. We went through cervical, but here's cervical as well. That's your neck. We did the planes, the frontal plane. Cranial. We went through cranial cavity. That's your skull. Deep, we went through that when we looked at directional terms. Same with distal. Dorsal, that's that back. I told you some of these terms will come back at you. Femoral. Femoral is that thigh. So femoral is this region from here down to just about the knee, just above the knee. That is that femoral backside. Gluteal. Gluteal is your behind. Because we have those gluteal muscles that make this up. Back up again. Let's see, hallux. Hallux is your big toe. Iliac or inguinal. That is that hip crease. Inferior, we went through that with directional terms. Lateral with directional terms. Lumbar. Let's see if those are labeled back here. Lumbar is that low back. Medial olecranon or olecranal. I like to add extra syllables some days. Olecranal is the back of the elbow. So that pointy elbow, when you bend your arm, that point, that's that olecranal. There is a part of the bone that's called the olecranon process. You'll learn that when we get to bones. But that's where that term actually comes from. Patellar is that knee. Because your kneecap is known as the patella. That specific bone is called the patella. So that's where that comes from. Pollex is your thumb. Popliteal is the back of the knee. There's a muscle back there called popliteus. There's also blood vessels that run through there that are named popliteal as they travel through that area. So those terms will get used. That posterior, the backside of the body. Proximal we did with directions. Sagittal, median plane, we did that with the planes. Superficial, that's closer to the skin surface. Superior means it's closer to the top. Whoops, you know how your wrist are carpals? Your ankle is tarsal. So carpals for wrist, tarsal for ankle. That transverse plane we went through, and then ventral is towards that front. So those are all the different terms that are required by the department for you to know. Where they're at, what their names are. I usually add one more in there. I put it in the lecture. I'm going to say it here too, is that not the antibrachial. Sorry, I hit the wrong one. There it is. Anticubital. Anticubital is that elbow, the front of your elbow. I mentioned that just because those of you who are going to be drawing blood, if people who study phlebotomy, or this is the area where blood is most commonly drawn, is that anticubital fossa, that front of that elbow. I like to point that one out for that reason. It's something that's going to come back to you. You will hear it again. Microscope. Well, this is recorded for an online class, so you won't be using a microscope. You still need to know the parts of it because microscopes, depending on where you're going to go after this class, you may still be using them somewhere, so you kind of need to know what you're referring to. So the arm of the microscope is that back portion that kind of connects the bottom to the top portion of that microscope. The base is the bottom, though it sits on the table. We have our coarse focus knob. This moves this stage up and down fast. The condenser determines how much light is being shown and how through onto whatever slide you're looking at. The eyepiece or the ocular lens this is what you're looking through to look at a slide of something. The iris diaphragm is down towards the bottom. It helps that condenser really with the light. That mechanical stage, we have mechanical stage and stage. The mechanical stage holds the slide in place, but it moves around. So you can move that slide in different directions to get better views of all the different parts. We have the different objective lenses. There's anywhere from 3 to 4 usually objective lenses on a microscope. And this picture does not show the on-off switch. It's usually on the back somewhere. The ones that are at COD, their on-off switch is actually usually hidden behind the cord that you wrap up. And that is everything that you need to know for Lab 1. There's a little bit of extra that I added in there because it'll either help with the lecture exam or it will help with other material throughout the class. Thank you very much for listening.